Magandang gabi po, Luzon, Visayas at Mindanao.
Magandang hapon,
Nasa
ang patrol ng Pilipino.
Nagbabalita at naglilingkod sa inyo saan man sa mundo.
This is the two biggest broadcasting network in the Philippines. The latest research suggests that the news can shape us in surprising ways, from our perception of risks to the content of our dreams, to our chances of having a heart attack. Why it's very important to have our own Filipino media outlet to promote Filipino cultures in Australia.
As you know, my career by profession is that I'm a journalist and the editor of Money magazine right now.
This is Michelle Baltazar, publisher of Australian Filipina and editor-in-chief of Money magazine.
There's always breaking stereotypes is the number one thing. Number two is inspiring Filipinos, young Filipinos out there that, hey, look at us. These are our stories. For example, we did a story on Melanie Perkins, who is the billionaire chief executive of Canva. I don't think a lot of people know that she's got a Filipino background in her. Then we wrote a story yesterday about a nurse who turned into a cybersecurity professional. These are stories that maybe a Sydney Morning Herald wouldn't pick up, or not something that Channel 7 would pick up, but Australian Filipina will definitely write those stories.
Hi, I'm Miko Santos, the founder of Kangaroo Firm Media Lab and creator of Podcast Creator Society and Podcast Freelancer Hub. This is a Filipino-tastic, a podcast series about Filipino diaspora and their stories to inspire others to make a social impact to our community. What is the role of media in preserving the Filipino identity in a foreign land?
I think all the media, community publications, whether it's Australian, Filipina, we all have the same role. And like you said, you kind of see the culture diluted, the Filipino identity diluted because of the world we live in. I mean, it's not anyone's fault that a young kid who grew up here would speak English, not Filipino or Bisaya or Ilocano, for example. So one of the things we do is really break the stereotypes about this kind of monolithic view of Filipinos as just the one thing. We're actually a diversity of subcultures even within the Philippines. There's the indigenous communities in Luzon, which are very different, for example, in Mindanao or Visayas.
This is Juan Paulo Legaspi, chairman of 5EBI.
So my name is Juan Paulo Legaspi, and I am a broadcaster and general volunteer for Radyo Filipino. And I'm also the chairperson for the radio station that Radyo Filipino Incorporated plays from, which is called 5EBI.
He tells us the main objective of the creation of Radyo Filipino in Adelaide.
One of the core objectives of Radyo Filipino is to preserve and celebrate the Filipino culture, and that's through language, but also a deep appreciation of what the Filipino culture means. You know, through whether it's talking about the food, through the festivals, through cultural events, and the diversity of cultural events. So, we've had Cebuanos, Visayans, we've had different explorations of different types of what it is to be a Filipino, but that's the primary function of it is to celebrate it through language and music.
Michelle tells us the challenges when she creating the first and only women's lifestyle and business publication with the Australian Filipino community in mind.
Yes, it was a good question. It was very challenging in that, of course, it wasn't going to be a full-time job for me because it is a small community. I think on last count, there are more than 300,000 Filipinos in Australia. And in the city that I'm in, we're talking about maybe 100,000 or less. But everyone tried to help. And to be honest, it's really just the inspiration from the community. They really wanted our own publication and tackling our own cultural issues. So it got easier. And now I'm working with two dedicated writers, Chi De Jesus and Bioli Calvert, as part of the Australian Filipino team.
Setting up a Radyo Filipino is not easy, but it worth it. Say Juan Paulo Legaspi.
In the earlier days, before we had music streaming and MP3s, you'd physically have to buy a suitcase worth of CDs and bring them over from the Philippines, just so you can have a library of. We had quite an impressive library of CDs and vinyls when they were used more extensively, because that's how you collect the music.
Michelle and Juan agree that once there's always a gender imbalance in anything we do, but the important, we have a medium to spread the message about Filipino culture.
Why is that? One, there is always already the gender imbalance in anything we do. There's the proverbial glass ceiling for any woman to succeed in their career, profession, or their personal lives, combining with work and family commitments. And if I can say this in Tagalog, on top of that is pagiging migrante or pagiging Pilipina. So it's almost like double the challenge. So why did we do this? It's really to say, hey, we exist, we're here, and we're trying to contribute to the society. And the Australian Filipina gives that voice that would otherwise be lost or would disappear if it doesn't exist.
Especially when you're first or second generation Filipino. So in my case, I'm a first generation Filipino, but I came here when I was quite young. Going through and listening to Filipino radio growing up, it helped me kind of address a lot of the cultural and identity questions that especially when you're going through high school, you start asking yourself, who am I? A lot more. And listening to those types of programs, especially in an environment when that type of content wasn't widely available. And even now, we can go on Netflix, we go on YouTube, we can watch whatever we want from the Philippines. But what radio and localized radio helps is it explores the topic within the confines of your local geography. So it's talking about what it's like to be a Filipino in Adelaide. And I thought that was really, that it spoke to me because it was a lot more personal rather than just watching, I don't know, Eat Bulaga online. You have a much more deeper and personal connection with the culture.
We sit down with some of the members of Radyo Filipino in Adelaide to understand more the importance of radio to spread the Filipino culture in Australia.
Ano ba sasabihin? Full name, ganun.
Just introduce yourself first.
Okay. Hi, I'm Adel Lopez, and I'm currently the ERPI president.
Ethnic Radyo Filipino Incorporated.
Ethnic Radyo, yep. Ethnic Radyo Incorporated president, and I'm also one of the Barkada Radio hosts every Friday night. So that normally it's first Friday of the month. So that's me.
It's quite amazing how Adele, Rose, Lourdes, and Celia telling us the story of Radyo Filipino, how it started.
The Radyo Filipino really was founded because of the settlement issues, yung mga bagong Pilipinong dumarating dito, mga bagong migrante, yung 1970s to 80s. Kasi we want to listen to our songs. We want to listen to Filipino talking other, our Filipino language. Kaya ang ano noong time na yon is to promote our language and our culture as well. Tsaka doon lang kami nagkakanon, uy, may birthday ngayon, birthday ni so-and-so, punta tayo. Parang ganun. So, in a way, we were able to bind with each other kasi nandun yung radyo. At saka every time, Merry Chris, happy birthday, so-and-so, Miko, happy birthday. Oy, birthday ngayon ni Lourdes, magpapalitsyon, something like that. So,
Bang Lourdes yata yun.
oo, sa'yo yun.
I think even if I wasn't there in 1978 or the 80s, it's easy to imagine that people would be feeling homesick for the language and feeling homesick for the music and anything Filipino back then. And dahil nga wala pang internet noon, information and all this music is not that readily accessible back then. So radio was still the most popular and easiest medium.
That's true.
To turn to. Like even in when I heard the first program of Radyo Filipino, it was by accident, and this was maybe 2006, 2007 or 8 when I first heard it accidentally in the car because I was fiddling with the radio stations while my husband was driving. Bigla akong narinig, ay, may nagsasalita ng Tagalog, na-excite ako. Bigla excited ako dahil, ay, may nagsasalita ng Tagalog sa radyo. And that's when I discovered na meron palang radio program sa ano. So, inalam ko kung anong oras yung program, but I was still working in an office back then. I brought a little Walkman, and every time it was on, I would listen. Not knowing that one day, not knowing that one day I would hear my own voice on the radio.
Yes. Nainabita kita, di ba? Nung magkita tayo sa palengke.
What do you think, Adel?
Sa akin naman, tama yung sinabi ni Ate Lourdes. So more of, para hindi natin makalimutan yung sariling wika natin. On top of that, para sa show ko naman, more of presenting or featuring yung mga bagong artista or new music na hindi pa natin napapakinggan, or pwede rin yung mga lumang awitin na gusto nating balik-balikan. So, yun yung importansya nung radio community, yung Filipino radio community sa akin. Kasi parang nakakakonekta pa rin tayo. Kahit nasa Australia tayo, feeling natin nasa Pilipinas pa rin tayo kahit papaano.
As Juan Paulo Legaspi said,
I think it'll be a really interesting change, and I've started to notice. So even in the early days of Radyo Filipino, it was broadcasting news from the Philippines into Adelaide. These days, we still talk about what's happening in the Philippines, but because there's a bigger diaspora community, it's becoming more and more about what's happening with the Filipino community in Adelaide. And then believe it or not, because it's now online sometimes, we get audiences in the Philippines listening in what's happening in Adelaide. So it's kind of gone in the reverse direction. But I think the most important part is still maintaining that connection with the Philippines, but also Filipinos abroad. I think there's a lot of global and universal connection about what it is to be a Filipino outside the Philippines. And I think that's going to be the shift in the next 5 to 10 years about it's not just broadcasting in Adelaide, but it's celebrating what's happening in Adelaide around the world.
That makes absolute sense. So I'm part of a not-for-profit group called ADHICA, which is a association for media professionals in the country. And we are made up of online publications, radio programs, also TV. So for example, SBS Annalyn Violata and Edinel Magtibay supports Adhika. And then there's also what we call the PhilPresid group. So already Australian Filipina is collaborating with all the local radio stations, but in particular Radyo Tagumpay, which is a Sydney-based radio. And we also liaise and share news with other online publications like Bayanihan, or before there was also the Filipino Australian. And really at this stage, there's no competition. I think the room is big enough for all the community media to work together to write the stories and share our culture.
Whatever the medium you're using, it's a good to have connection to our motherland. We are Global Filipino. This podcast is written and hosted by me, Vico Santos, produced by Kangaroo Firm Media Lab, Australia's independent podcast management company. Research by Yvonne Santos, edited and mixed by Jaime Barra, sound design by Ivan Santos. Our podcast producers, Jamie Lopez, assistant podcast producer, Renee Bernales, voice-over artist, Kiko Malikden, music by Audio Hero. Filipino-tastic logo by Sid Tabar. Thank you to our guests, Michelle Baltazar, Juan Paulo Legaspi, Adel Lopez, Rose Holland, Lourdes Blinko, and Celia Guillermo. See you in 2 weeks' time, and this is Filipino-tastic. Mabuhay!